MacTaggart. How are you doing?
I am doing well, thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
I'd like to start this out with something I've been interested in now for years, actually ever since listening to Peter Russell talk about the global brain. It,
Hmm.
it seems like there's an underlying pattern to life, and it's been there since the beginning of time, and it shows up in self-organizing itself into higher and more complex forms. In other words, first we had subatomic particles that came together, and when they reached their maximum, hydrogen and helium, the atoms started to come together as molecules. When molecules reached their maximum potential, they self organized into cells. As cells grew and evolved into their maximum, they self organized into organisms. And now we are organisms in our own right, evolving, and we've somewhat reached our maximum as far as physical potential. We have all of our fingers and toes and we can ambulate. And now it excuse me, now it seems like we have also reached that cusp, that moment of transition to where we will start energetically reaching out to other planetary cells, human beings, to form a more global consciousness. Is this what you're talking about when you're talking about the bond? Is sensing this energetic connection with other things that almost dissolves those things and rises into a more complex form?
Yes, exactly. When I talk about the bond, I mean that nature has a drive for wholeness and has created us only in relationship, and like one giant superorganism. So it's not even a drive; it's a fact. Between our subatomic particles, between our bodies and their environment, between us and everyone with whom we come into contact. Um, in all of our societal structures, there is a bond, which is a connection, a relationship so profound and integral that it is impossible to say where one thing ends and another thing begins. So you see this mirrored in every aspect, just as you described, from subatomic particles. They aren't really a thing. They're a relationship, and you see that mirrored all the way up in complexity in the world. And so that finally our societal structures, even though we have falsely created competition, everything in our bodies, everything in our minds, everything about us wants to bond.
Right. Okay, now this brings me to a question that, because see, what was once the evolution of consciousness has now become a conscious evolution because of our participation in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that being the case, that's probably the good news and the bad news, because up to this point, we have been going by the laws of nature, atoms to cells, I mean, atoms to molecules, molecules to cells, and so on. But now we
Mm-hmm.
are conscious participants because we've become self aware. And I
Mm-hmm.
noticed in your book you bring up David Bohm, and I'm sure you're
Mm-hmm.
familiar with the experiment that he did by pushing atoms together to the point of plasma.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as soon as you condense atoms and get enough atoms together to the point where it's plasma, they do this very, very strange thing where they stop acting as individuals and they start acting in unison. What you do to one atom does to all the atoms. So I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
to myself, okay, if that's the case, then population is a critical point here. But there's a problem because everything that we look at, food supply, water supply, dwindling resources, the environmental decay, almost everything, competition for land, is based upon overpopulation to some degree. But do you think it's possible that we need a certain amount of people to ignite that oneness in the same way that David Bohm was talking about in his experiment with plasma?
I think that's a really interesting point. I've seen oneness occur in very small groups. And I've been playing around with with the intention experiment, how much is thought magnified by a critical mass? And the interesting thing about the experiments is it needs more than one. Yes, it needs a small group, but it doesn't necessarily need millions. It works. The experiments we've had have had results whether we have 100 people or we have 15,000 or 20,000. So part of what I'm thinking about and part of what I've been writing about with the bond is very much about the power of small groups to infect and change big groups. And the reason I say that is still from that same impulse you talked about, the impulse to bond. We're very infectious. Human beings have been designed to be very infectious with each other, socially infectious. So if we were sitting across from each other, if I'm smiling, you're going to start smiling. If I speak, your eyes and everything else are moving in syncopation to my voice. I'm watching you on my Skype and I can see that's happening just now. If I'm happy or if I'm lonely, I'm more likely to have happy or lonely friends, not because I self-select people who are like me, but because my happiness or loneliness naturally spreads down a social network. And the same thing happens with positive emotions or positive actions. Even one little act of generosity goes viral and goes down a network. So I see small groups as being critical, actually, to the effects of big groups, because I see this, this instigation and this change that can occur. So in, say, our culture of selfishness, all it takes is one or two little change agents, as they've shown in game theory. They've shown it just takes one or two instigators to change a whole game around, to turn a culture of selfishness into a culture of generosity.
Okay, what would you say then? Because I hope that what you're saying is the way it is, and I have a feeling it probably is. But how do we come to recognize a solution with one of the problems in a major city like Los Angeles or Sacramento is we have groups of Iranians, we have groups of Koreans, we have groups of Chinese that almost refuse to integrate. They stay within their groups. And when I was reading the bond, you're saying that this is one of the good things for health because you can identify with your social group. But it's also on a larger social level, it seems to be one of the detrimental things for social evolution because these pockets of people not integrating, not learning the language is causing division. How do you think this plays out?
That's a great question. Well, there's a simple way to solve this, I think, that's used with a lot of social conflict around the globe. I'll give you an example through a psychological study, one of the most beloved studies of all time. It had to do with a bunch of 12-year-old boys. They were sent to a summer camp, and they were divided into two groups, and they each took a bus. Each group took a separate bus. They were asked to create separate names for themselves, so they called themselves the Rattlers and the Eagles, and they were asked to create their own identities, their own flags. They had their own living quarters, and they were told they were going to participate in highly competitive games. And the camp counselors, who were all, by the way, psychologists in disguise in the days before informed consent, engineered it so the boys would be in neck-and-neck competition on all the games. After a while, they didn't have to engineer any kind of competition. The boys were absolutely killing each other. They were beating each other up. They were stealing each other's flags. They were destroying and ransacking each other's living quarters. And they refused to have anything to do with each other other than with animosity. So then the camp counselors engineered a series of crises in the camp that could only be sorted out by the collective involvement and efforts of all the boys in the camp. So they had, a blocking of the water supply, and the boys had to lift it all together, and many things like that. And here's what happened. After a while, the boys started sitting together. They began talking together. They began interacting and befriending each other. And before long, they decided to unanimously vote to travel home on the same bus at the end of the time. Arms around each other, one of the boys spending all of his pocket money to buy ice creams for the whole lot. It's called a superordinate goal. And what it means is a goal that requires the collective efforts of everyone involved. That kind of a goal melts differences. It doesn't matter what somebody has in the past. When everybody's working together, an interesting phenomenon happens. The science shows that your brains start resonating in tandem. You become like that collection of atoms that you talked about with David Bohm. You become a superorganism. You become, as they call in quantum mechanics, you become coherent, a coherent bunch of subatomic particles, all resonating as one. So superordinate goals can come in many guises. But in a neighborhood, I mean, I'll tell you about our neighborhood, because we have a mixed neighborhood, and people weren't really interacting very well until we did one thing. Until we were under siege, a mobile phone company, a cell phone company, decided to put in a bunch of cell towers around our neighborhood. And of course, everybody was alarmed about this. So we formed what was basically a housewives brigade. We got a bunch of women together, and so few guys too. We started leafleting around. We started bringing it to the schools. We started leafleting apartments near us. And this very mixed neighborhood that never interacted both worked together as a beautiful little organism. And we chased away one of the giants of British industry. I live in the UK. But it also brought this neighborhood together. And we found the soul of a community we never thought we had. So I think one of the fastest ways of overcoming difference is this kind of creating a little superorganism of your neighborhood or your community where people with differences can still come together. And it's amazing how many times it works. People involved in conflict resolution, even evolution, try to use this. There's a guy called Don Beck who authored the whole idea of spiral dynamics. He calls himself a heat-seeking missile. He works in areas of conflict around the world. And for instance, he's working in Palestine right now. And he's telling the Israelis and the Palestinians, let's together create the Hong Kong of the Middle East. Let's just come together and create something new together. Let's forget what happened in the past and work together toward it. And he's having a lot of success.